So I'm going to talk today about minimum purchase requirements and how they can be used in terms of terminating and performance managing underperforming distributors. So what are minimum purchasing requirements? They're obligations that are in distribution agreements that oblige the distributor to make a certain amount of purchases from the supplier. The idea is to ensure that the supplier is making a certain amount of sales in any given territory and to provide the supplier with a tool to manage the distributor. Distributors are appointed generally over geographic territories or to certain customer groups to sell to customers. And if the distributor isn't selling to customers, it's not buying from the supplier. And that failure by the distributor to sell a sufficient quantity of product defeats the object of having appointed the distributor in the first place. So minimum purchasing requirements are included in agreements in two ways. The first is with reference to the value, and that's the value of the products that are subject of orders placed by the distributor and then accepted and fulfilled by suppliers. And the second is with reference to quantity, so that is the quantity of products that are the subject of orders placed by the distributor and then accepted and fulfilled by the supplier. What suppliers and distributors will prefer does depend industry to industry. However, on a very general kind of basis, the supplier will prefer minimum purchasing requirements to be with reference to value. And that's because it provides for a more precise measurement of performance. And that's particularly the case where perhaps the products in the range differ in price. In contrast, a distributor will prefer to have minimum purchasing requirements to be with reference to quantity. And that's because it provides flexibility. It provides the distributor to be able to select or cherry pick certain well-performing product. However, of course, that does cause an issue sometimes to arise in respect of range. So suppliers might expect for there to be a certain amount of range on the market that the distributor isn't providing. So in terms of minimum purchasing requirements and reliability and the use in contracts and then in day-to-day performance management with distributors, whether they are kind of something that can be relied on will depend on what's agreed. So whether that's agreed in formal written distribution agreements or perhaps informal unwritten distribution agreements via emails, conduct, meetings, things like that. It all will depend on what is agreed or what is understood by the parties. A more formal written distribution agreement, you'd think, would generally provide for a clear way forward. However, poorly drafted or incomplete minimum purchasing requirements can cause more of a headache than you might think. Uncertainty will always give rise to a risk of a dispute. That's the case throughout commercial contracts, and it's important to make sure that the minimum purchasing requirements are clearly set out in your agreement. The consequences of failure to meet those requirements are clearly set out in the agreement, and that those consequences are adequate when it comes to rely on them. Often formal written distribution agreements are somewhat half complete. So perhaps a minimum purchasing requirement is included for years 1, 2, and 3, but then the agreement is either silent as to what happens after that point, or something is included that says the parties will meet to agree the kind of years 4, 5, 6 at a later date. And that's understandable. For a supplier to look over the horizon to such an extent can be difficult, especially in the early stages of the relationship. However, that idea of meeting at a later stage to agree is an agreement to agree, which under English law is unenforceable. So if you wanted to rely on that to cause your counterparty to meet with you to discuss future requirements, that's not something that you could force them to do. So this particular scenario highlights the importance of thinking about what's happening later down the line in terms of requirements. And understandably, where requirements can't be set for the whole duration of the term or the expected term of the agreement, you might wish to consider including something along the lines of where the parties can't agree, the minimum purchasing requirements increase with reference to a percentage, or perhaps with reference to an increase in an index. So how about terminating underperforming distributors in terms of not meeting minimum purchasing requirements? Even where minimum purchasing requirements are included, as I said, the consequences need to be clearly and set out in a certain manner and be adequate for the circumstances that arise. And you might ask, in a distributor-supplier relationship, why would you want to look at minimum purchasing requirements? Why not just give notice? You don't have the same concerns that Emma was mentioning in terms of compensation indemnity in the UK. Well, distribution agreements are relational in nature. There's often huge investment by the distributor at the very early stages, and as such, notice periods tend to be on the longer side of things for commercial contracts. So perhaps you're looking at something like 6, 9 or 12 months. And for a supplier that's party to a distribution agreement with a distributor underperforming, it's unlikely the supplier is going to want to hang around for that period of time. So what does termination look like? In the termination clause for written distribution agreements, the most ideal situation for a supplier will be an immediate right to terminate when minimum purchasing requirements are not met. It's an absolute right, it's binary, either the requirements are met and there's no termination right, or they're not met and there's a termination right. So one strike and you're out approach, and it's unlikely to be acceptable to a distributor unless you are dealing with a supplier in a very strong position. So what else could be relevant? Perhaps there's an immediate right to terminate when the distributor fails to meet the requirements over a certain period of time. Perhaps this is with reference to quarters or kind of on a half-yearly basis. A less favourable option is the material breach option that Emma mentioned, and that's the idea of having to show that the materiality threshold has been met to call a termination event is a risk, because if you get it wrong, you're likely to be on the receiving end of a damages claim for damages in lieu of failure to give proper notice. Other than termination, it is possible for a supplier to provide that the distributor is to pay the difference, so between the purchases made and the minimum purchasing requirement. This is a type of liquidated damage, and therefore you have to be careful that it's not so ridiculous, disproportionate, unreasonable in terms of what you're actually trying to protect for the sales in that territory as to be a penalty, because a penalty under English law, again, is unenforceable. It's a bit of a case of be careful what you wish for. Another option would be to change the grant, so change the distribution grant. So perhaps you might take away some of the territory, perhaps you provide for some of the customers to be taken in-house to the supplier, or the distribution arrangement, if it's exclusive, maybe you decide to change it to a non-exclusive distributorship. The issue with that is if you have a non-exclusive distributor in place, you can only ever appoint another non-exclusive distributor, which can be unattractive. For unwritten agreements, consideration should be given to whether the failure by the distributor is such that it provides for a failure of performance. Failure of performance to the most severe degree would provide for a failure of consideration, and without consideration there's no valid contract, so the contract would not exist. Whether operating under a formal written distribution agreement or an informal unwritten distribution agreement, what is important is a paper trail, and that's something that Veronique and Ellie will touch on, but a supplier will want to have to hand evidence of underperformance. And likely the distributor will likely want to point to evidence where the supplier has given the okay to underperformance. So be careful in terms of being able to use the right, what might come back at you. It's also one of those situations where it's lose it if you don't use it. So if you have a right that's triggered under a contract in terms of minimum purchasing requirements, look to use it within a reasonable time. And then finally, just in terms of other considerations with minimum purchasing requirements. The first is where the effect of the minimum purchasing requirement on the distributor is such that the total purchases that it makes ensures that 80% of those total purchases are from the supplier, it will amount to a non-compete. Under English and EU law, as a competition law point, those non-competes have to be limited to 5 years, or the term of the agreement if it's less. Generally, volume commitments can cause an effect on the market and trigger competition concerns. Consumers effectively can have less choice as to where to buy product. However, in a distribution arrangement, it's unlikely to trigger serious concerns. A distribution agreement will often fall within a vertical block exemption regulation, which is something I think Steve might touch on. So termination is a severe step. You do need to make sure that you have everything lined up before you terminate, so as to ensure that smooth transition to the next stage. If you have a replacement distributor in the wings, if you're operating under an exclusive distributorship, don't appoint that exclusive distributor in replacement until termination has taken effect. And that's not whilst notice is running, it's when notice has expired. Otherwise, you're committing a serious breach of your distribution agreement. You should be thinking about stock. So have there been orders placed by the distributor, accepted by the supplier, only then for the distribution agreement to terminate? Do you have to fulfill those orders? And if you do, what terms is the distributor under in terms of selling those products on to its customers? For unwritten distribution agreements, there's likely to be an implied license in terms of being able to use the trademark to continue selling within the territory. You should have a look at your distribution agreements to see what's said about selling stock back to the supplier, or perhaps selling to your newly appointed distributor. Perhaps there's a handover period that's provided. It's all things to be thinking about, in addition to cost, who's going to be paying for kind of transfer of stock and things like that. And the final point is that the distributor might be holding stock it's not yet paid for. That's a common issue that we kind of advise on regularly in terms of how do you get your stock back. And really what that turns on is your written distribution agreement, your written terms and conditions of sale. One of those two or both might have retention of title provisions, and they're really important. Without retention of title, it's unlikely you're going to get that stock back. The distributor might take issue with the fact that you've terminated the way that you have, and say that it's going to set off liabilities and keep that stock, the liability that you owe it for your termination of the distribution agreement. Retention of title means that until payment's made in full by the distributor, the supplier owns the stock, even though it's with the distributor or perhaps a third-party warehouse. And that's particularly important when you're dealing with administrators who are kind of in control of the stock. You need to be able to have that piece of paper that shows your retention of title claim. So that's everything I wanted to cover today in terms of minimum purchasing requirements, and I will hand over to Veronique and Ellie in terms of disclosure.